Theists are faced with a puzzle. Did God know 1,000 years ago that you'd be watching this video right now? If so, was your choice to watch this video really free, or did you have to do it? This is the puzzle of divine foreknowledge and human freedom. One solution that's been offered to the puzzle is the view that God exists outside of time. Now, how exactly is that the solution? Is that a good solution? These are the questions that I'm going to be asking my guest tonight, Dr. Taylor Sear, who is a professor of philosophy at Samford University. Hey there, Dr. Sear.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So, I've actually interviewed you previously on this topic, and that video's done extremely well for my channel. And do you want to just mention that briefly and maybe give the audience a sense of what makes this interview different?
Sure. Yeah, thanks again for having me, Jordan. In that first interview, we talked about sometimes people call it the paradox or the dilemma of free will and divine foreknowledge. And we were mainly focused on laying out the problem in some detail and then talking about some of the main proposed solutions. But we didn't go into any real depth on any of the solutions. So this is kind of a sequel to that video in that we're going to look at the timelessness or outside of time approach to trying to rescue free will.
Awesome. Okay, well, let's go ahead and dive right in. First, we need to do a few preliminary things. So, what is free will?
So, in the sense at stake in this puzzle, this paradox, free will is usually conceived of as something like the freedom to do otherwise than what you actually do, or the ability to do otherwise. Sometimes people call this leeway freedom. I mentioned in the last interview that one kind of metaphor that's helpful for getting a handle on this conception of free will is imagine yourself going through a garden of forking paths, coming to various forks in the road, and you get to decide whether you're going to go to the left or to the right. And yeah, the idea is it's up to you which way you go, where that's kind of a metaphor for the decisions that you make throughout your life, or maybe some of your overt actions. You could make one decision, you could make another, and both are genuinely up to you. Now, also in that video, I kind of said my view is we should conceive of free will slightly differently, but that's the conception of free will that the timelessness solution tries to show is compatible with divine knowledge, omniscience.
Perfect. So, how is that view of free will threatened by divine foreknowledge then?
Right. And here again, check out that other video. We laid out one version of the argument in a good bit of detail, and there were lots of good questions along the way that helped to clarify the challenge. But here's a slightly different way of putting it. So this isn't just rehashing things for people who have watched the other video. Imagine that God exists and that he is infallible and has infallible comprehensive knowledge of what we will do tomorrow or what anyone will do in the future, right? So take any action that you'll perform tomorrow, and then given our supposition about God, about his being infallible and knowing what you'll do tomorrow, it follows not only that he knows now what you'll do tomorrow, but that he knew even 1,000 years ago what you would do tomorrow. And so now the question is, well, with respect to that action, are you free? Or do you have the freedom to do otherwise than what you will actually do? It seems like the answer is no, because look, what would the world have to be like for you to do otherwise than what God knows that you'll do? It seems like either you'd have to make it so that God had a different belief 1,000 years ago, or you'd have to be able to make God have a false belief. Since he had the belief that you'll act in such a way tomorrow 1,000 years ago, yeah, for you to do otherwise, he'd have to be wrong, or he'd have to have a different belief. But it looks like, you can't act such that God had a false belief, right? He's infallible. And it also looks like you can't make God have a different belief 1,000 years ago. That's not up to you either, because, well, that was 1,000 years ago. You weren't around 1,000 years ago, presumably. So there's no way that you can affect what God's beliefs 1,000 years 1,000 years ago were. At least that's the idea. So if all that's the case, then it looks like you don't have the freedom to do otherwise tomorrow with respect to that action. And of course, there's nothing special about that action or that time in question. The argument's going to generalize to all human behavior. And so it looks like we're caught in a dilemma where we have to either say that we have free will, or we have to say that God has comprehensive foreknowledge. But it's hard to see how both could be. So that's the dilemma or the paradox.
All right. And the response that maybe has gotten the most attention from you on YouTube is dependence, the dependence view. You actually did an entire debate with Philip Swinson on Capturing Christianity's YouTube channel. He takes the dependence view. So do you want to mention that here before we get into timelessness?
Yeah, I do, because as we'll see, I think one challenge for the timelessness view is to say why they're not really just a version of the dependent solution. So yeah, this dependent solution, the idea is something like this. Look, God's foreknowledge didn't cause or make you act in the way that you did. In fact, God's knowing what you'll do in advance doesn't explain why you act in that way. In fact, it's the other way around. The reason that God knew 1,000 years ago that you would watch this video now or that you do some action tomorrow is because you're watching this video now or because you'll do some action tomorrow. The order of explanation goes from your action to God's beliefs. And so that's one part of the dependent solution, is to say God's beliefs depend on what we'll do. And then the other part is to say, well, we shouldn't hold fixed anything that depends on what we do when we're assessing whether or not we're free to do otherwise. Another way of putting that is anything that depends on your behavior, God's knowledge included on this view, doesn't constrain our freedom. It's not the sort of thing that we think we should hold fixed in asking whether you're free to do otherwise. So yeah, two parts to the dependent solution. One, at least some of God's beliefs, his beliefs about what we do, depend on what we'll in fact do. And then second, yeah, those dependent beliefs, dependent facts, we shouldn't hold those fixed when assessing whether we're able to do otherwise than what we actually do.
Excellent. Okay.
Yeah,
so
and if people are interested in that, Philip Swinson has written some on this and has done some of the best work on it, I think. And so that debate that you mentioned on Capturing Christianity lays out the solution in some more detail. And I raise an objection, but I'm kind of sympathetic to the view. I think it's got a lot going for it that other responses to the dilemma of freedom and foreknowledge don't have going for them. So I think it's probably the best bet if you're trying to resolve the paradox without just landing on one of the horns of the dilemma.
So what led me to do an interview like this where we focus just on timelessness? There was kind of two reasons. One was that you had written a paper on the topic, and your work I find really interesting, so I thought that would be good to feature. But also, when you were doing your debate with Philip Swinson, what came up in the live chat repeatedly was this claim that, well, God exists timelessly, and that's the solution. That's the answer. That's all you need. So I thought it would be good to kind of build upon that conversation with Philip Swinson in the hopes that maybe those people who are in the live chat will watch this and maybe interact with your ideas a little. So go ahead and lay out, what is the timelessness solution to this problem?
Good. Yeah. So the timelessness solution, it goes by many names. So people might have heard of it before and not realized it. It goes back at least to Boethius in the early Middle Ages. Thomas Aquinas defended it in the 13th century. Many other classical theists have thought something along these lines has got to be the case. So it's sometimes called the Boethian solution, the Thomistic solution. Sometimes it's just called the eternity view or the atemporalist view. I'll just call it the timelessness view. But the idea is, okay, God is not a temporal being. He's outside of time. Some people disagree about exactly how to make sense of God's being outside of time. But one idea is God exists in an eternal or timeless realm where all times are present to him in a sense simultaneously. So maybe there's some duration to God's existence, but it's not that God experiences one moment after the next, the way that you and I experience time. So in other words, he doesn't experience things successively or in succession. One reason for thinking that is you might think, well, if God's completely perfect, well, then to experience time in the way we do is to change, and that would be to become less than perfect if he's, starting from a position of perfection. So there are lots of reasons that the classical theists will have for affirming this idea that God's outside of time, he's timeless. But that's sort of the view of God that's supposed to give rise to the objection to the dilemma. So we can contrast that timeless conception of God with the conception of God I was presupposing in laying out the argument, which says that God is infinite. He's eternal in the sense that there's no time where he doesn't exist. But on this rival conception of God's connection to time, sometimes called sempiternity, God exists at all times, but he's there in time. So he's there 1,000 years ago with the belief that you'll watch this video now. So the timelessness theorist will say, well, strictly speaking, God didn't have the belief 1,000 years ago that you would watch this video today. Instead, God timelessly believes that, at this precise date and time, you'll watch this video. But he has that belief from the timeless or eternal realm. Okay, so that's the view of God. How does it apply to the problem? The idea is, one of the reasons that I said it seems like you can't act otherwise if God knows what you're going to do is that doing so would require the past to have been different, namely for his belief 1,000 years ago to be different or something like that. But look, if God doesn't have his beliefs in the past, well, then it seems like putting God outside of time will solve this problem. Your acting otherwise would only require that God timelessly believe differently than he actually timelessly believes. But that doesn't require acting such that the past would have been different. So one way of putting this is we think that the past is over and done with. There's nothing you can do about at least relevant parts of the past now. That we have expressions like there's no use crying over spilt milk. But to say that God's outside of time and so has his beliefs timelessly, we can avoid any worry about having to change the past. So the idea is supposed to be that there's no reason to think that we can't act such that God would have a different belief. Okay, so that's the basic idea. I mentioned Boethius, Aquinas. They're kind of the go-to examples of people who've developed this view. In the contemporary literature, the last few decades or so, Eleanor Stump and Norman Kretzmann have done probably the most work to defend not only the view that God is timelessly eternal, but also to apply it to the foreknowledge problem. So they have a classic paper, I think it's from 1981, just called Eternity, which is complicated, but it's worth working through. And so if anyone's really interested in this type of view, I would highly recommend that paper. I really like it. There's one other person who's defended the view who's would be familiar to your subscribers. Michael Rhoda has a paper defending the view, and you've had him on your channel before. So what these authors and philosophers, theologians want to affirm is that God is omniscient, and that omniscience includes comprehensive knowledge, exhaustive knowledge of everything that will happen, past, present, and future. So including, what will happen with respect to you in the future, what you'll do. And yet you have the freedom to do otherwise. And we can affirm both of those things because the past is fixed. We can still say that, and putting God outside of time allows us to say that we have freedom, even though God knows everything that's going to happen. So that's in a nutshell what the view is.
Very good. All right, so now that we've gotten the response, let's look at some objections to this kind of timelessness response to the puzzle. So lay these out, these objections.
Okay, good. So I think we only talked about one in our last interview, which is is from Linda Zagzebski, who's, I think we also referred to her as Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on foreknowledge and free will. It's excellent. If I can shamelessly plug something else of mine, I recently interviewed Linda Zagzebski for a new podcast that my friend Matt Flummer and I have started. It's called The Free Will Show, so people should subscribe to that. But in the fourth episode, I think we talk about divine foreknowledge or theological fatalism, and Linda Zagzebski is our guest, and she walks through various solutions to the problem, including the timelessness solution. And her objection to the timelessness solution is basically this: yes, when we originally presented the dilemma of freedom and foreknowledge, we sort of supposed that God was in time, but we can restate all of the premises of the argument, changing references to God's belief 1,000 years ago to God's timeless beliefs. And it looks like the argument's just as persuasive, changing all those things to God's timeless beliefs. So I won't go into any more detail. People that are interested can go back to that other interview. The sort of the thing that's still a kind of question mark is whether the idea that the timeless realm is fixed or outside of our control is as intuitive as the idea that the past is fixed and outside of our control. So one thing that Linda says in the interview on the Free Will Show is we have expressions like there's no use crying over spilt milk, but we don't have anything parallel about the eternal realm, like there's no use crying over eternal milk or something like that. So that might not be as intuitive, and that might give space for the proponent of the timelessness solution to still say, well, that parallel argument doesn't work, or it's not as persuasive as the original argument. So that's one objection. Another objection, and this is one that doesn't come up in the paper of mine that you mentioned, but that I think is worth taking seriously. I think it dates back to Jonathan Edwards. I don't know of anyone who developed it before him, but recently it's been developed by philosophers David Whitaker and Peter Van Imwagen, and it has to do with the idea of prophecy, or the possibility that God does something in time, whether it's revealing to someone what will happen in the future, or in Peter Van Imwagen's example, God inscribes a sentence on a monument, on an object that predicts what will happen in the future. There's something about that kind of prophecy that's compatible with the view that God's outside of time, but that raises just as much of a challenge to our free will as, God's beliefs if they were in time. So maybe it's worth saying a little bit more about that example from Van Imwagen with the monument. Imagine that, you'll do some action at noon tomorrow, and 1,000 years ago, maybe it's wrong to describe what happened as God creating this monument 1,000 years ago, but one effect of God's timeless act was that this monument was created 1,000 years ago, ex nihilo, out of nothing, and in that monument is inscribed the sentence, so-and-so will do such and such an action at noon tomorrow, right? Where tomorrow is the date of tomorrow, right? When the precise time, noon. If God did that, given God's infallibility, well, then for you to do otherwise than what you're going to do tomorrow at noon, either it would have to be the case that God's a deceiver, and so he put something on this monument that was false, or it would have to be the case that you could make it such that the monument didn't exist or said something different. In other words, you'd have to do something that would require the past, something that really seems to be part of the past, like the existence of this monument, would have to be different. And it seems like you don't have that power. And, the proponent of the timelessness solution wants to maintain the fixity of the past, that past is over and done with. That was the whole point of appealing to God's being outside of time to solve the problem. So this seems to raise the worry that, well, even if God's outside of time, he could do something in time that would make it so that your action is inevitable or fated and outside of your control in that sense. So that's another objection. Should I pause and see if you have thoughts or questions about that before I go into the last one?
So I want to make sure that I'm following that example. So we're considering objections to the timelessness solution.
Right.
And so Peter Van Inwagen has offered a kind of thought experiment where even if God does exist timelessly, so he grants that to the objector, he says God could still act in such a way in time so that this puzzle arises again. It seems like you weren't free. Something was fated or determined. But I guess what I'm missing somehow is even if a timeless God did that action, why would that wouldn't that still only apply to something God does in time, but it leaves the time what's done outside of time untouched?
Yeah. Right. The idea is to avoid this issue about whether the timeless realm is fixed or not, and just to say, well, even if that part of reality, the eternal realm, is not fixed outside of our control, if we want to say that the past is fixed, well, this is going to raise just as much of a problem. The fact that God could create this monument in time, which, in the past, which is fixed, that it plays the same kind of role functionally as the idea that God himself is in time with the beliefs about the future. So the monument acts as a kind of proxy for the sempiternalist conception of God as having his beliefs in the past. And the idea is, if God could do that, even from the timeless realm, and in fact, many Christians in particular think, well, God has, revealed what's going to happen to prophets in time. If God could do that, well, then, he could do that about anything, about any action. So what he could do is he could write like a book of the world that describes what everyone will do at every time. And he could have created that book like a million years ago, just like put it on another planet or something. And if God could do that, it looks like our actions are just as fated as if, well, it was just God himself there in time instead of
okay
time.
So that helps, that the point of the thought experiment is God existing timelessly actually ends up being very similar, I guess, in all the relevant ways to this monument. And if this monument, or the statue, I think you're calling it, the statue would serve as a challenge to our free will, then similarly a timeless God serves as a challenge to our free will, something like that.
I think there's one extra step where the idea is supposed to be that, even if God's outside of time, since he could create this monument, right, that would, at least if you're thinking that the past is fixed, would take away our freedom. I don't know, there's something about his having that power to put that thing in time that seems to make it such that our actions are just as fated as if God were in time and knew what we were going to do in advance. Yeah.
Okay. So what's the next objection then?
Yeah, so the other one, maybe it's related, but this one is from Alvin Plantinga. It's related to the point that Jonathan Edwards made, and Plantinga talks about Edwards in a paper of his from, I think it was 1986, from the 80s, on the Occamist solution to the problem of freedom and foreknowledge, which we talked about in our last interview. But Plantinga wants to say putting God outside of time doesn't help with the problem, and here's why. Look, even if God has his beliefs, his knowledge timelessly, nevertheless, if God knows timelessly that I'm going to do X tomorrow at noon, well, then 1,000 years ago, it was true that God timelessly knew that I would, do such and such X tomorrow at noon. And so the idea here is, even if God isn't in time, and so his beliefs and knowledge are timeless, there are still truths at times about what God timelessly knows. And so in order for me to do otherwise tomorrow at noon, right, it would have to be the case that something that was in fact true 1,000 years ago wasn't true 1,000 years ago. And that seems like it requires the past to have been different. Now, of course, Plantinga and other Occamists think things like truths about the future, perhaps even God's beliefs about the future, those aren't the kinds of things about the past that are really fixed and outside of our control. But Plantinga's point is basically just this, that moving God outside of time isn't by itself going to solve the problem. You're going to have to appeal to something like the alchemist's hard fact, soft fact distinction, or something like that to get out of the problem. Putting God outside of time doesn't do it all by itself.
And that alchemist view we also discussed in the previous interview in more detail, so people can check that out. Okay, but the point there, is the timelessness solution by itself isn't going to solve that. You have to end up appealing to some extra explanation, something like that, some extra view. Okay, so now that you've laid out kind of three main objections there to the timeless view, you got I always struggle to say her name. Zagzebski. And then the Peter Van Inwagen objection, and then the Plantinga objection. So how do the timelessness theorists respond to these objections?
Right. So as far as I know, Stump and Kretzmann have done the most work on responding to objections to this solution. There's some other papers. That paper by Michael Rhoda I kind of referenced earlier, I think it's from 2010. It sketches the view. It doesn't so much, I don't think it's aimed at addressing these exact objections. But the Stump and Kretzmann response, they really focus on addressing Plantinga, and they talk about Jonathan Edwards along the way and that kind of worry. But in my view, and this is what I've tried to argue in my recent papers, is that my view is that in order to make sense of the timeless realm not being fixed, like not being something that constrains our freedom, it's going to have to be the case that what God timelessly believes and knows depends on what we do. So to go back to that dependence response to the original problem we were talking about earlier, right? The idea is supposed to be like God's beliefs depend on what we do, not the other way around, and anything that depends on what you do shouldn't be held fixed in assessing whether you were free to do otherwise. And I think ultimately the timelessness theorist is committed to exactly those two claims. And so it turns out that the timelessness solution is really just a variant of the dependent solution. So you could imagine there being two dependent solutions, the sempiternalist and the timelessness variants. And so why do I think that that's what the timelessness theorist must say? Why do I think they're going to have to be committed to that? Well, in responding to Plantinga and then also to the Edwards worry, what Stump and Kretzmann say is basically that God's timeless knowledge of what we do is similar to your knowledge of what I'm presently doing. So you can observe me acting, and the fact that you're observing me in the present, right, in no way takes away my freedom to do otherwise, right? And the idea is supposed to be God's connection, the connection between God in the timeless realm and us at any given time is like that present awareness of what someone's doing. But if that's the case, well then, it makes sense to say, it's pretty natural to say that God's timeless knowledge depends on what we do. So it's a natural thing, and actually they're committed to saying something even stronger, that this is really the only way that we're going to solve the problems raised by Edwards and Plantinga. How did I put it in the paper? I think I put it something like this: if God's timeless knowledge is not dependent on what actually happens, then we're not going to have any reason to have think that we have some kind of handle on the timeless realm, that we have some reason not to hold it fixed. So if you say, okay, Plantinga, it was true 1,000 years ago that God timelessly knew what I would do today, right? But that's not the kind of thing that we should hold fixed in assessing what we're free to do now. The only way to get to sort of make plausible the claim that that truth is not fixed, that we shouldn't hold it fixed when assessing what I can do now, is to say that the truth of that proposition about God's timeless knowledge depends on what I do. And the same is true of God's actual beliefs or his knowledge. In order to make sense of the timeless realm being, different from, facts about the past, like milk's having been spilled, we have to say that that timeless realm is somehow dependent on what we do. Um, I think it's even easier to see this in response to the worry from Zagzebski, right? The way she puts it is, look, there's a parallel sort of fixity of the timeless realm. It's parallel to this principle of the fixity of the past. The past is over and done with, at least parts of the past, like milk's having been spilled. You can't do anything about that now, maybe barring time travel or something like that. But you can't do anything about that. Similarly, Zagzebski thinks you can't do anything about the fact that God timelessly has beliefs about what you'll do, because the timeless realm seems a lot like the present. However, right, if you think that the timeless realm, and perhaps the past is not like this, right, but if you think the timeless realm is somehow dependent on, or some feature of the timeless realm, like God's beliefs, it's somehow dependent on what we'll actually do, well, then there's no reason to think that it has the same kind of status as the past that's over and done with, like the milk's having been spilled. So in any case, I think the worries start to disappear the more you start to think that God's timeless knowledge depends on what we'll do. And in fact, I think that's really the only way to make the worries disappear. And, if people are interested, they could check out the paper, because I interact more closely with the specifics of Stump and Kretzmann's view, which I think is very good. It's a very sophisticated account of the timeless realm and how God's related to times, what it is for God to be simultaneous with times. So I like all that. In fact, I think the timeless conception of God has a lot going for it. So I'm attracted to that part of the view. But I think in order to make sense of its application to freedom and foreknowledge problems, we're going to have to say that, yeah, God is somehow aware of what we'll do. His knowledge depends on what we'll do, and that's what's going to help us escape the worries.
Very good. Okay, so that pretty much brings us to the end. Why don't you take a minute or so and just try to sum up the discussion as a whole?
Yeah, good. So there's this original problem. Seems like we have to choose either we have the freedom to do otherwise than what we actually do, or we have to say that God's omniscient, but we can't say both, because if if he's infallible and omniscient, it seems like we're not really free to do otherwise. It would require the past to have been different. But if God's not in the past, God's outside of time, well, then it looks like maybe we do have the freedom to do otherwise. Ultimately, I think in order to escape worries for this timelessness solution to the problem, we're going to have to say, and the reason that God's being outside of time and having his knowledge timelessly doesn't constrain or fate our actions is that those beliefs, that timeless knowledge, depends on what we'll actually do. Now, there are a couple implications I think are worth mentioning very briefly. One is something I gestured at earlier, which is that the timelessness solution, I think people have thought of it as its own type of solution to the problem, independent of, Ockhamism, Molinism, which, as we said in the other interview, it maybe isn't really a solution to this problem. Certainly, people haven't really been thinking of it as a version of the dependence view. But what I've tried to show is it's really just one variant of the dependence view. You could have the sempiternalist view. That's what my friend Philip Swenson defends in the debate. But you could have a timeless variant of the dependence view, and that's interesting. I think that can help us make progress, even if it's kind of like a subtle dialectical point, a point about how we should organize views. It can help us to make progress in thinking, oh, this is really just a variant of this other view. And for that reason, and this is a separate implication, in evaluating the timelessness view, we'll have to take into account any sort of existing objections to the other variant of dependence views. Some of those objections may well apply to the timelessness view, since it's committed to claims about dependence. So if you think there are any sort of theological worries about God or his knowledge depending on us, well, that's going to be a problem for the timelessness view as much as it's a problem for the dependence view. Or if you think that dependent facts that depend on what we do, aren't necessarily within our control, or they might still need to be held fixed. That's one of the arguments that I gave. I argued for that claim in the debate with Philip. You might think the same point applies even to the timelessness version. Anyway, so I think there are those upshots, but also I'm hoping that this will spark some conversation about, whether these two variants of the dependence view have any sort of relative advantages. So one thing that hasn't really been explored in any detail, and this is sort of, where new work should be done, could be done, is does putting God outside of time help to answer any of the potential problems for the other version of the dependence view, the view that God's in time? Some people think there's a worry about the past depending on the future. This looks like backwards causation, and maybe God's being outside of time helps to solve worries about that. I'm not sure. I don't think so, but you might try to develop these kinds of ideas that, well, really the timelessness variant of the dependent solution has advantages over the sempiternalist view. I don't think there's any paper that's developing exactly that line yet, but that would be an interesting place for new work to be done and for progress to be made.
Excellent. All right, so thank you very much for walking us through this timelessness solution, and I appreciate the back and forth, here's what the solution, or here's what the problem is, here's a potential solution, here's some objections, here's some responses. So, okay, what I would like to do now is turn to you, the viewer, and give you an opportunity to ask questions. We've already got some in the chat. If you've already typed a question, type it again, please, so that I just look at the bottom of the list. It's easier for me to find that way, and I really appreciate that. While you're doing that, I will mention you can become one of my patrons by going to www.patreon.com/ccapologetics, and you'll be able to sign up for either $5 a month, $10 a month, or $25 a month. I'd really, really, really appreciate your support. If you value the work that I'm doing on this channel, this really helps me. And you also help feed my wife and 1-year-old son. So I greatly appreciate it. Now, let's turn to the question. So the very first one comes all the way from England, and it's from one of my patrons, Tim, and he asks, if God is timeless, is there any contingency whatsoever? How can we avoid modal collapse? So maybe you want to mention what contingency is, what modal collapse is, and then answer the question.
Yeah, sounds good. So to say that something is contingent is to say, well, if it contingently exists or it's contingently true, it's to say that it exists, it's true, but not necessarily. So I take it most people think like your existence, my existence, these are contingent things. The truth about you're watching this video now is a contingent truth. It didn't have to be the case that you're watching this video now. Now, maybe you think, given certain other facts, either about God and his knowledge, or about, I don't know, if determinism's true, the distant past and the laws of nature, these things make those contingent truths inevitable given these antecedents, these other things. But an example of a necessary truth to kind of contrast a contingent truth with would be like, I don't know, truth like 2 + 2 = 4, or anything that just couldn't have been false is going to be a necessary truth. Some people think that, and this is the classical view of God, that God's existence is necessary, but nothing else exists necessarily. So any other, truth about the created world is going to be a contingent truth. However, the person raising this objection thinks, well, if God's outside of time, does that somehow make it the case that everything that happens in time happens necessarily? Somehow the modal collapse point, that's a way of saying, like, modality has to do with possibility and necessity. To say that there's a modal collapse is to say all these things we took to be possible or to happen contingently, it all turns out to be necessary. There's only one way the world could be. Like the fact that you're watching this video now has the same necessity as 2 + 2 = 4 or something like that. So I think that would be bad. I think most people want to avoid modal collapse, even people who think that God exists necessarily. So the way of trying to solve the problem is to say, God, even though God exists necessarily, God didn't have to create the world, or God didn't have to create the world in exactly this way. And so even though, everything that exists is in some sense dependent on God for its existence, it didn't have to be that way. God could have done things differently. So I guess, without further reason to think there has to be a kind of modal collapse just by thinking that God is outside of time and exists necessarily, I guess I would want to say, yeah, the idea is supposed to be, and smarter people than me, like Thomas Aquinas, would say that there's a way of working this out, that God exists necessarily, God's simple in some sense, doesn't have any parts, and also the consequences of God's simple act, the consequences of God, who is pure act, well, they're diverse. There's a multiplicity of them, and they could have been different. They're contingent. So our existence has a different status than God's, despite the difference. Well, despite God's being outside of time. I guess without further reason to think that God's being outside of time makes there be a modal collapse. Hopefully, there's no worry there.
Okay, we're gonna go to the next one.
Okay.
This is from...
Probably people will have follow-up objections to that one. We'll see.
This is from another patron of mine, BDS. So he asks, what about free will, not as being able to choose otherwise, but as having your choices originate with you?
That's a very good question and a very good conception of freedom. Yeah, so the way that I characterized free will, I even use the term leeway. The idea is, that what's really crucial to your having free will is you're being able to do otherwise. You're having alternative possibilities. But an alternative conception of free will, sometimes people think they're closely connected, but another way of kind of emphasis, or another way to focus on what free will is to focus on sourcehood, or you're being the source of your action, or you being the originator of your action. That's what it is for your act to be free. I'm very sympathetic to that conception of freedom. Some people who have views of free will where free will is incompatible with causal determinism think that in order for you really to be the source of your action, you had to have had alternative possibilities at some point or other. But if you're a compatibilist, in particular, if you're inspired by the kinds of cases that are sometimes called Frankfurt-style cases, which we talked about in our last interview, you might think that the freedom we care about, the freedom required for moral accountability, moral responsibility, is just, it doesn't require the ability to do otherwise at any point. And so, if you have a conception of free will like that, where you can be the originator or source of your action, even if you never had the ability to do otherwise, well, then I think it sort of straightforwardly follows that kind of free will is compatible with divine foreknowledge. The problem doesn't arise for that conception of free will.
Very good. Okay.
And that's a good solution to the problem.
So I want to mention that I'm very thankful for Praise Jesus. He's given me a $5 super chat and said keep it up, so I appreciate that a lot. And he consistently on my live streams supports me with these super chats. I'm very, very grateful. Thank you, Praise Jesus. All right, so let me find the next question here. They should be near the bottom now. I remember SlamRN asked a good one. Let me pull this one up. So SlamRN asked, she said, if God can move in 2 dimensions of, is it pulling it up? Yeah. If God can move in 2 dimensions of time, wouldn't that solve the problem? Jesus was able to exist in time. Why is it such a problem?
Interesting. I hadn't really thought about God existing in 2 dimensions of time, although maybe what SlamRN means is God could be timeless and in time. Maybe that's the 2-dimensionality. And certainly, Christians that affirm the incarnation will say the second person of the Trinity in his divine nature is timeless and in his human nature is in time. That raises a host of other Christological puzzles that we don't have to get into. But I guess one worry is if suppose Jesus is infallible even in his incarnate life. That just really makes the problem salient, that the prophecy problem we were talking about earlier, that, well, if he's in time and infallible and knows what will happen in the future, it seems like those things are inevitable. There are places in the New Testament that talk about Jesus seeming to not know things, maybe, doesn't know. I don't know. There's certain things that it seems like he says that he doesn't know. And so that raises other puzzles for how to understand exactly the connection between God's taking on the human nature, being in time, and then his timelessness. But I don't think there's any help to the timelessness theorist or any way of solving the problem by saying that God is both in time and outside of time. If anything, that sort of exacerbates the worries that the argument brings up, I think.
All right. So let's do Andrew Moon's question. He said, could Dr. Sear explain what the... hold on. Something's in my way. Could Dr. Sear explain what the response to Plantinga's objection is again? I didn't get it. Or how do Stump and Kretzmann respond to Plantinga's objection?
Right. So, the basic idea is they want to say, look, Plantinga, the worry he's raising about it being true 1,000 years ago that God timelessly knows that I'll do X tomorrow at noon. Plantinga's got a solution to that, and it's appealing to the hard soft fact distinction, the alchemist solution. And so what they basically want to say is, well, this worry isn't a deep worry for our view, but the reason that they're able to say that, I argue in my paper, is they're sort of presupposing that God's knowledge is dependent on what we do rather than vice versa. And so all of their references to God's awareness of what we do, God's knowledge having the same status as your knowledge of what I'm presently doing, right? The idea is the order of explanation is from what we do to God's beliefs, to his timeless knowledge. And so the response, even though they don't quite put it in these terms, it's committed to the dependence claim that God's timeless knowledge depends on what we do. And for that reason, it's not fixed. It has the same status as my awareness of what you're doing now. So that's the response. It's longer. I don't want to get into the weeds, but that's basically their response and why it's committed to the dependence solution.
Okay. So then Justin Mooney asked the following. He says, suppose you have strong fixity of the past intuitions, but unlike Zagzebski, no strong fixity of the timeless intuitions. So you got strong intuitions about the fixity of the past, but no strong intuitions about the fixity of timelessness, if I'm understanding correctly. Mm-hmm. In that case, does the timelessness view help?
Yeah, good. I'm glad that Justin brought that up, because that is one way of trying to move the debate forward, is to say, okay, sure, the timelessness view is just a version of the dependence view. But look, it's just so plausible that it's at least not implausible that the timeless view could be dependent on what we do. Whereas, the past, that seems fixed. It's not dependent on what we do, or at least even if it is, it's outside of our control. So you could think, unlike Zagzebski, that there is an important difference here. And that would be one way of trying to show that the timelessness variant of the dependence view has an edge on the sempiternalist variant. I guess one kind of residual worry for that exact move is the worry from Peter Van Imwagen's monument. I think he calls it freedom-denying past object or something like that. So the worry then is, well, even if the timeless realm is not fixed, if you still want to maintain that the past is, you're going to have to say that God couldn't do this thing that seems like God should be able to do, namely create a monument 1,000 years before your action, predicting what you'll do. And actually, I haven't, people that are paying very close attention will notice that I didn't actually say anything in response to that objection. It seems like actually a sort of residual worry for the timelessness view is not only is it committed to the dependence claim, and so the appeal to timelessness seems kind of redundant or unnecessary, but it looks like they're even going to have to give up the fixity of the past as long as they're committed to the idea that prophecy is possible, because God could still do this thing in time that would take away your freedom if the past is fixed. So I think in the 2010 paper, Michael Rhoda addresses this head on and sort of accepts the consequence that, yeah, in the weird case where God creates an object that, or he has someone prophesy what you'll do, in that case, if his timeless knowledge depends on what you do, then even though that thing is part of the past, some prophets prophesying X or the monuments saying what you'll do, those parts of the past aren't fixed. So that's a departure from the original timelessness solution, which tries to maintain the past is fixed. To me, it just seems like, well, you can have that view, but it's really just the dependence view, and you just think God's outside of time, but it doesn't seem like that's doing any of the work in responding to the argument.
All right, final question comes from Liz Jackson, and she asked, what does the timelessness aspect add to the dependence solution? Why should we add the extra controversial feature of the view, timelessness?
Well said. I think that's basically what I think. I guess we've been getting at that a little bit in the last couple of responses I've given to other questions, but I guess the idea is, some people who have been appealing to timelessness in this debate about freedom and foreknowledge have seemed to be presupposing that the appeal to timelessness is doing some work, and that's what I'm just not convinced about. I think it's not really doing any of the heavy lifting. It's all the claims about dependence and the dependent facts not being fixed that's doing the work. So what I think proponents of the timelessness solution need to do, if they really want the fact that God's outside of time to be doing some work, is to answer Liz's question. Like, what is it that the timelessness that claim is doing? Is it doing any new work? Maybe I'm not kind of writing that off as an impossibility. I just think we haven't seen in this literature yet any good reason to think that the timelessness stuff, the fact of God's being outside of time, is really doing any work. That's not to say we shouldn't think God's outside of time, right? Liz says it's controversial, and it is. So if your only reason for accepting that God's outside of time is that it helps with the free will foreknowledge problem, well, then I would say don't accept it for that reason. But maybe there are other good reasons for accepting it. So, yeah.
All right. She says, oh, okay, so we agree. Yes. Liz, you and Taylor agree that this timelessness response adds nothing, or at least seems to add nothing to this problem. But you still disagree, I think, because Taylor thinks God exists timelessly, but you, Liz, based on what you were saying in the live chat, think of God as existing in time, if I'm correct. So there's still a healthy disagreement.
That's right.
All right. Well, maybe that could be a future interview about whether God exists outside of time or in time.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Sear. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you. This was awesome. Yeah.
And everyone, please go right now and subscribe to his podcast. I think it's called The Free Will Show.
Yep, that's right.
Yeah. So you can get that, I'm sure, anywhere that does podcasts.
That's right. Yeah.
All right. And thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. And we'll see you soon.